The tow truck's engine roared to life. Harold Mitchell watched helplessly through the hospital window as his 1987 Jeep Cherokee was hoisted into the air like a discarded toy. 73 years old, wearing the same faded flannel shirt he'd worn for 3 days straight, Harold pressed his weathered palm against the cold glass. His wife Martha lay dying just 20 feet behind him, and now they were taking away the only thing that connected him to the outside world. "Sir, you can't park there," the security guard had said with all the warmth of a parking meter. Harold had explained about Martha, about the chemotherapy, about how he'd been coming here every single day for 8 months. The guard just shrugged. Rules were rules. The 15-minute loading zone wasn't for people like Harold, people who needed to hold their dying wife's hand for hours at a time. The Cherokee had been parked there for exactly 17 minutes. Harold knew because he'd been watching the clock, watching Martha's labored breathing, counting every precious second. 17 minutes to grab a cup of coffee from the vending machine. 17 minutes that would cost him everything. That old Jeep wasn't just transportation. It was Harold's lifeline, his freedom, his dignity on 4 wheels. The monthly Social Security check barely covered Martha's medications, let alone a taxi to the hospital every day. Without that Jeep, Harold would be trapped in their tiny apartment, unable to reach his wife during her final days. But they had no idea what was hidden in that glove compartment. They had no idea who Harold Mitchell really was, or what he'd sacrificed for this country 50 years ago. They saw an old man in worn clothes driving a beat-up vehicle, and they made their judgment. Society has a way of making invisible the very people who once stood between us and darkness. If you believe our veterans deserve better than this, hit that like button right now. If you think dignity doesn't have an expiration date, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will change how you see every elderly person you pass on the street. Some battles are fought long, after the war ends. Harold shuffled back to Martha's bedside, his knees aching from standing too long. She was awake, her once bright blue eyes now clouded with morphine and exhaustion. "Where's the car, honey?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines keeping her alive. He couldn't tell her, couldn't add that burden to her suffering. Instead, Harold took her frail hand in his calloused one and lied with the tenderness of 60 years of marriage. "It's right outside, sweetheart, waiting for us." Martha had been his everything since 1963. They'd met at a USO dance in San Diego, her in a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine itself, him in his dress uniform with fresh, corporal stripes. She'd asked him to dance, bold as brass, and Harold had been too stunned by her beauty to do anything but follow. 3 months later, he shipped out to Vietnam. 3 months after that, she was his wife. The Cherokee had been their adventure vehicle, their escape pod, their mobile home during the lean years. They'd driven it across country twice, camped in national parks, hauled furniture for their first apartment. Every dent told a story, every scratch held a memory. Harold had maintained that engine with religious devotion, changing the oil every 3,000 miles, replacing parts before they failed, treating it like the faithful companion it had become. Now, it was gone, towed away like trash, impounded like evidence of some crime. The crime of being old, of being poor, of needing 17 minutes to buy coffee while your wife fights for her last breaths. The hospital's billing department had already called twice about overdue payments. The parking fees were adding up, they said, as if Harold had chosen to make the hospital his second home, as if watching the love of your life fade away was some kind of luxury vacation. The system seemed designed to extract every last penny from families already drowning in medical debt, to punish love itself. Harold closed his eyes and remembered Martha singing along to the radio during their cross-country trips, her voice harmonizing with Patsy Cline as mile markers blurred past. He remembered camping under stars in Montana, making love in the back of the Cherokee when they were young and fearless. He remembered rushing to the hospital when each of their 3 children was born, Harold's hands shaking on the steering wheel, the Cherokee carrying them toward the most important moments of their lives. What the tow truck driver found would change everything. 20 miles away, at Mickey's Auto Impound, Tony Castillo was having the worst day of his career. The Lot was overflowing with vehicles. The paperwork was backing up, and his boss was breathing down his neck about processing the new arrivals. Tony had been working tow yards for 15 years, and he'd learned not to get emotionally involved. Cars were just metal and rubber. People's problems weren't his problems. But something about the old Cherokee bothered him. Maybe it was the rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, or the hospital parking stickers covering the dashboard, or the way the vehicle had been maintained despite its age. This wasn't some abandoned junker or deadbeat's ride. This was somebody's lifeline. Tony opened the driver's door to inventory the contents, standard procedure for impounded vehicles. The interior was immaculate, smelling faintly of Martha's lavender perfume and Harold's Old Spice aftershave. On the passenger seat sat a small cooler with sandwiches Harold had packed for his long vigils, the same turkey and Swiss he'd been making for Martha for 6 decades. The glove compartment was stuffed with the usual detritus of a long marriage: registration papers, insurance cards, a small flashlight, Martha's reading glasses, Harold's blood pressure medication. But at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag that had yellowed with age, Tony found something that made his hands tremble. It was a letter, typed on official White House letterhead, signed by the President of the United States. The paper was fragile, creased from years of careful folding and unfolding, but the words were still clear, still powerful, still absolutely devastating in their implications. Tony read it once, then twice, then called his supervisor over with a voice that cracked like a teenager's. "Boss, you need to see this. We messed up bad." The words on that letter would make grown men weep. "Corporal Harold Mitchell," the letter began, "your extraordinary courage under fire during the Battle of Firebase, Charlie, has earned you the gratitude of a nation. Your actions on March 15, 1969, directly saved the lives of 18 American servicemen and prevented the overrun of a strategic position. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star with V device are insufficient recognition for the magnitude of your sacrifice, but they represent the enduring thanks of the American people." The letter was dated April 3, 1969, signed by President Nixon himself. But there was more, documents that painted a picture of heroism that Hollywood couldn't have scripted better. Harold Mitchell hadn't just served in Vietnam. He'd been a genuine war hero, the kind of soldier whose actions echoed through military academies and medal ceremonies for generations. Tony kept reading, his understanding of the morning's events shifting like tectonic plates. The battle report was there too, typewritten testimony from Harold's commanding officer describing how Corporal Mitchell had single-handedly held off a Viet Cong assault while his wounded comrades were evacuated. Harold had taken shrapnel in his left leg and right shoulder, but he'd kept fighting until the last man was safe. 18 soldiers owed their lives to Harold Mitchell. 18 men who went home to wives and children, who built careers and raised families, who grew old with dignity because a 22-year-old corporal from Ohio decided that their lives mattered more than his own safety. And this morning, they'd towed his Jeep from a hospital parking lot like he was some deadbeat who couldn't follow simple rules. Tony's supervisor, Mike Kowalski, was a Vietnam veteran himself, drafted in 1968 and shipped to Da Nang with the 3rd Marine Division. He read the letter with the reverence of a man who understood exactly what those words meant, who knew the weight of sacrifice they represented. Mike had seen plenty of action himself, but nothing like what Harold Mitchell had endured. "Jesus Christ, Tony," Mike whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We towed a genuine American hero's car while he was visiting his dying wife in the hospital. The shame hit them both like a physical blow. This wasn't just a bureaucratic mistake or an overzealous parking enforcement action. This was a betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for, a slap in the face to a man who'd already given more than any citizen should ever be asked to give." But the real shock was still coming. Mike called the hospital immediately, asking to speak with someone in administration about Harold Mitchell. The woman on the phone was initially defensive, explaining their parking policies and the need to keep emergency lanes clear. But when Mike explained about the letter, about Harold's military record, about the magnitude of their collective failure, the line went quiet for a long moment. "Oh my God," the administrator finally whispered. "Harold Mitchell. We've been billing him for parking fees. We've been threatening to send his account to collections. We never asked. We never knew. The story spread through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses who'd seen Harold sitting beside Martha's bed for months suddenly understood why he carried himself with such quiet dignity despite his obvious poverty. Doctors who'd noticed his deference and politeness realized they'd been treating a genuine American hero like just another indigent patient. Harold's oncologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, felt physically sick when she learned the truth. She'd been pressuring Harold about treatment options they couldn't afford, suggesting experimental therapies that cost more than his annual income. She'd seen the stress in his eyes, the way he apologized for asking questions about cheaper alternatives, the way he carried the weight of financial impossibility alongside emotional devastation. The security guard who'd called the tow truck locked himself in a bathroom stall and cried for 20 minutes. James Morrison was 24 years old, working security to pay for college, and he'd never served in the military. He'd grown up hearing stories about Vietnam from his grandfather, but they'd always seemed like ancient history, irrelevant to modern life. Now he understood that history lived and breathed and sat in hospital parking lots, that heroes aged and suffered and needed 17 minutes to buy coffee. The hospital's CEO, Patricia Williams, called an emergency meeting with her entire staff. She'd built her career on efficiency and policy enforcement, on treating healthcare like any other business. But standing in that conference room, explaining how they'd collectively failed one of America's heroes, she realized that efficiency, without compassion, was just organized cruelty. "We're going to make this right," she announced, her voice shaking with determination. "Whatever it takes, however much it costs, we're going to honor this man the way he should have been honored from day one." But making it right wouldn't be simple. Harold's insurance had lapsed, his medications were rationed, his dignity had been systematically eroded by a system that treated poverty like a moral failing. The damage went deeper than towing fees and parking violations. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small humiliations, the death of respect by 1,000 cuts. Martha's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The doctors gave her days, maybe hours. Time was running out for grand gestures and institutional apologies. If the community wanted to honor Harold Mitchell, they'd have to act fast. What happened next restored faith in humanity. Dr. Chen made the first call, reaching out to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The VFW commander, retired Marine Colonel Jack Patterson, listened in stunned silence as she explained the situation. Patterson had served 3 tours in Vietnam himself, and he knew Harold's story by reputation. Firebase Charlie had become legendary in military circles, the kind of last stand that defined what it meant to be an American soldier. "That son of a bitch is still alive?" Patterson asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Harold Mitchell is a goddamn legend. Every Marine recruit learns about Firebase Charlie. I can't believe he's been struggling alone all this time." Patterson activated every veteran network in the county. Within 2 hours, the story had reached retired generals and Medal of Honor recipients, VA administrators, and military historians. Harold Mitchell wasn't just some anonymous old soldier. He was living military history, a man whose actions had been studied in war colleges and memorialized in official Army records. The media picked up the story by evening. Local news crews rushed to the hospital, national networks started making calls, and social media exploded with outrage and admiration. The hashtag #JustHonorHarold began trending, sharing the story of a hero hidden in plain sight, a man whose sacrifice should have guaranteed a lifetime of respect, but who'd been reduced to counting quarters for parking meters. Tony Castillo drove the Cherokee back to the hospital personally, but he didn't come alone. A convoy of motorcycles followed him, members of the Rolling Thunder organization who'd made Harold's fight their own. Behind them came cars filled with veterans, active-duty military personnel, hospital staff, and ordinary citizens who'd heard the story and needed to be part of the solution. The hospital parking lot had been transformed. Someone had brought a small stage, others had hung American flags and yellow ribbons. The crowd grew throughout the evening, hundreds of people gathering to honor a man most of them had never heard of that morning. Harold had no idea what was happening outside. He sat beside Martha's bed, holding her hand, humming the songs they'd danced to at that USO club 60 years earlier. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally squeezing his fingers or whispering his name. These were their last hours together, and Harold wanted them to be perfect. When Dr. Chen came to his room with tears in her eyes, Harold assumed the worst. "Is it time?" he asked, preparing himself for the words that would end his world. "Harold," she said gently, "I need you to look out the window." The sight below took his breath away. Hundreds of people filled the parking lot, many in military uniforms, others holding signs and flowers. At the center of it all sat his beloved Cherokee, polished and gleaming under portable lights, surrounded by an honor guard of veterans standing at attention. Harold's legs gave out. He collapsed into the bedside chair, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Gratitude, amazement, validation, grief, joy, and a profound sense of connection to something larger than his private struggle. For months he'd felt invisible, forgotten, reduced to a burden on an overburdened system. Now he saw himself reflected in the eyes of people who understood, who remembered, who cared. Martha stirred at the sound of his sobbing. With tremendous effort, she turned her head toward the window, her failing eyes taking in the incredible scene below. "Harold," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "They remember. They remember what you did." Colonel Patterson made his way to Harold's room, followed by hospital administrators, city officials, and a delegation of fellow veterans. The old Marine stood at attention and delivered the salute Harold should have received 50 years ago, the recognition that had been lost in the chaos of an unpopular war and an ungrateful homecoming. "Corporal Mitchell," Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of military tradition, "on behalf of a grateful nation, welcome home." The words Harold had waited half a century to hear finally reached his ears. The ticker tape parades had never happened for Vietnam veterans. The hero's welcome had been replaced by protests and shame. But in that hospital room, surrounded by people who understood sacrifice, Harold Mitchell finally came home from war. The ceremony continued through the night. Veterans shared their own stories, active duty soldiers requested photos with a living legend, and ordinary citizens simply wanted to shake the hand of a man who'd embodied the best of America when America needed it most. Someone had contacted Harold's surviving comrades from Firebase Charlie, and they spoke via video call from around the country, their aged faces wet with tears as they thanked the man who'd saved their lives. Martha rallied for the celebration, staying alert longer than she had in weeks. She watched Harold receive the honors he deserved, saw him surrounded by respect and admiration, witnessed the healing of wounds that had festered for decades. Her husband was finally being seen for who he truly was, not just an old man with an old car, but a hero whose moment had simply been delayed. The hospital waived all of Harold's bills, not just the parking fees, but Martha's entire medical debt. The VFW established a fund to ensure Harold's remaining years would be comfortable, that he'd never again have to choose between medication and dignity. Car dealerships offered him new vehicles, but Harold declined them all. The Cherokee had carried him through this ordeal. He wouldn't abandon it now. Martha passed away 3 days later, surrounded by love and honor. Her final words to Harold were simple. "I always knew you were a hero, honey. Now everyone else knows too." The funeral drew thousands. Military units from across the country sent representatives. The governor issued a proclamation, and Harold's story became a reminder of how many heroes walk among us unrecognized, how many elderly faces hide incredible stories of courage and sacrifice. Harold still drives that old Cherokee, though now it bears special veteran license plates and is recognized throughout the community. He volunteers at the VA hospital, sharing his story with young veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. His message is simple: your service matters, your sacrifice counts, and America remembers, even when it takes 50 years to say thank you. The parking space outside Martha's former hospital room has been permanently reserved with a sign reading, "Reserved for American Heroes." It remains empty most days, but Harold stops by sometimes, sitting in his Cherokee, remembering the woman who loved him and the community that finally saw him. Every scratch on that old Jeep still tells a story, but now they're stories of redemption, rather than struggle, of a community that learned to see past the surface to the hero underneath. Harold Mitchell's battle for recognition is over, but his example lives on, reminding us all to look closer, to ask questions, to honor the quiet heroes who walk among us every day. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all ages, that dignity doesn't retire, and that it's never too late to say thank you to those who served. Comment below with the name of a veteran in your life who deserves recognition, because their stories matter too, and their sacrifice should never be forgotten.